What if I told you that the current composition of the 435-member U.S. House of Representatives is unconstitutional? And what if I told you that that number has been unconstitutional for more than a century, but nobody's doing anything about it? And what if I told you that this severely hampers American democracy, creating larger congressional districts than necessary, which are more easily bribable, and creating wildly disparate sizes in congressional districts, which violate the concept of one person, one vote? Oh, it's all true. All that and worse. My name's Chris, and on this channel, I remember things because someone has to. In this video, I'm going to be taking a little bit of a break from the Harvard Dershowitz Epstein files scumbaggery that I wallowed in the last two videos and turn toward a constitutional question, and that is the apportionment of the United States House of Representatives, its size, and how well Americans are represented by that body. If you're enjoying my content in as much as somebody can enjoy my content, there's a big QR code on the screen right now. If you're watching this, say, on a TV screen, that sort of thing, if you point your phone at that, that should take you to where you can subscribe to receive more of my horrifying videos about all sorts of things that are going wrong and largely ignored. Thank you for that. This could be a somewhat complex issue, but the idea of this sort of video is to simplify things and not make them more complex. So what I think I'm going to do is start by describing what the problem is now, and then go back in time and try and take things chronologically so you can see how things were done in the United States and how things changed radically in the early 20th century and became frozen in amber so that you have the blatantly unconstitutional condition that we experience today. All right, so currently, we have a massive violation of the concept of one person, one vote. There has been a precept in American constitutional law and laws regarding elections for decades, for over a century now, that each person's vote, we should be striving to have as equal to another person's vote as possible, that they should weigh in about equally to the best extent that we can when it comes to issues being voted on by representatives, representation, whether that be how things are weighed in congressional representation or at the state level. That is not what is happening now at all. The worst case scenario right now for underrepresentation in Congress is among the citizens of the state of Delaware, residents of Delaware. There are almost 1 million people in Delaware. It's about 990,000, give or take, and those people are represented by one representative. At the farther end of people who have the best representation, whose vote when they vote for a congressperson and win has the greatest amount of weight in congressional representation because of the way that the math hacks out, residents of Montana and of Rhode Island, there is a ratio of about 540 to 545,000 people to one congressional representative, one Congress critter. All right, so those are wildly disparate. In one case, you have somebody voting for a congressperson when they're 1 in a million, and in the other case, you have somebody voting for a congressperson in which they're 1 in almost 500,000. It's actually an 82% difference between the sizes of proportional representation of a constituent to a representative between the two in the same national body. Well, that by itself is already a violation of this concept of one person, one vote, which has been supposedly sacrosanct in constitutional decisions among the courts. In addition to that, we have this extreme problem that the United States was never supposed to be that damn big. We're headed toward 350 million people in the country, and there's a cap, an artificial cap that was placed in effect beginning in 1911 of 435 representatives. Thank you. So there's this cap of 435 representatives for what is now 350 million people. And just from the time of that freezing in 1911 until now, it means that each individual's representation has been diluted on average by about a third. That's one way of looking at that. But even in 1911, you could argue that people's constitutional rights were already being violated by underrepresentation. So let's try and wind back the clock and take things chronologically to better understand how we get here. Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3, which is known as the enumeration clause or the apportionment clause, lays out the way that we are supposed to do apportionment of House of Representatives. Now, the Senate, of course, gets 2 senators per state. It's meant to be more or less the United States House of Lords. It's meant to be a stabilizing force. There's some good pro-democracy arguments for doing away with the Senate completely, and those deserve a hearing. But on top of that, you have this concept that, well, the people's will is going to be represented, apportioned fairly by the House of Representatives, which is going to be based in population and not statehood. Fair enough. The rule for how to do that was laid out in Article 1, Section 2. And this is the origin of why we have the U.S. Census. Now, a lot of the U.S. Census these days, with questions like how many toilets do you have in your house, has become a tool for marketers and a subsidized tool for marketers at that. But the original purpose of the Census Bureau was just to figure out how many people were in the country, where they lived, and how we were going to apportion representatives. Beginning in 1790, the United States had a census, and we were supposed to add representatives and distribute them according to how that math worked out. Pretty simply, trying to get as close as possible. It's very clear the founding intent was to between 30 and 40,000 Americans per representative in the House. That's where things started. Now, the text of that clause specifically says that 30,000 is supposed to be a bottom cap. In other words, that you're not supposed to have anybody with a congressional district of 29,999 people or fewer, right? And that is what the language says, and people who defend the status quo and defend the idea of the 435 representatives being frozen in amber use that language to say, well, wait, that's not described as a target. That is described as a cap, which actually bolsters the idea that you could have 1 million people, you could have 10 million people in a congressional district, theoretically, if the population grows enough, and that would be just dandy and constitutional. There are very good reasons to believe that is not the case. The idea of how large a congressional district should be came up in discussions at the Constitutional Convention, including in September of 1787, and in fact was one of the last things discussed. George Washington himself was present at these discussions. Now, you may be aware of the fact that George Washington had very poor teeth. In fact, he had teeth that were made out of various substances and borrowed, and basically had a mouth that was, I believe the technical dental professional term was he was suffering from an extreme fucked up-itis of the mouthful area. I'm not a professional in that area, but I think that's what they would say. And as a result, Washington didn't speak up a whole lot about many issues. But this is the one time that apparently he did pipe up toward the end of the original Constitutional Convention. The initial proposal being discussed was that there should be about 40,000 Americans for each member of the House. And one of the members of the Constitutional Convention spoke up to say that, in his opinion, 40,000 was too many for a congressional district. That was too big. That didn't allow for correct representation. It should actually be lowered to about 30,000. Washington spoke up, however painful and embarrassing that might have been with the whole mouth issue, and stated that he concurred and basically made a short speech in which he said that it would be more fitting and proper for there to be a smaller number of people who were voting for congressional representation in order to have a functional democracy. So we know from the recordings of these discussions that that was an intent. Furthermore, you have the Constitution being ratified and being used as the functional document for the federal government, and then following on the heels of that, as you're probably aware, there was the bill of what we now call the Bill of Rights, which was 10 amendments that were ratified by the states, which were supposed to put limitations on a federal government by and large, and make the states feel better about being a member of this new federation that would not necessarily become just another British Empire. Ellipsis. But all 12 amendments were not initially Bill of Rights things. A couple of them were procedural. One of those amendments regarded the congressional pay raises and whether or not a current Congress could vote itself a pay rise. And that actually did become law a couple of hundred years later, once the correct number of states ratified it. Madison actually initially had 12 proposed amendments, of which 10 were ratified. The amendment regarding apportionment of representatives fell one state short of ratification. And that amendment was actually a plan for there to be a series of steps as the country grew, during which there would be a period of having 30,000 Americans per representative, a period of having 40,000 Americans per representative, and a period of having 50,000 Americans per representative. And this formula was laid out in an amendment that was ratified by one state short. Advocates today for smaller congressional districts refer to this as Article the First, so that you don't confuse it with the First Amendment, even though it was proposed as what would have been the First Amendment had it been ratified. And in any literature, what little literature you do see from the people who are pushing for a more democratic Congress, that's still what they refer to that as today. So there was a very clear intent from George Washington, from James Madison and others, that we should be aiming in the 30 to 40,000 person range per congressional representative, and not to be aiming for the 545,000 to 990,000 Americans per representative range. Very obviously, if you look at things, you would be looking at a radically differently sized Congress, and one that would have to operate radically differently. If you were to take, let's say, 350 million Americans in the next census and divide them by 50,000 people districts, to go by the Article the First formula, you end up with just a shade under 7,000 representatives that there would have to be in the United States Congress. If you were to go with the 30,000 representation formula, then you would actually have over 11,300 representatives in the United States Congress. One of my arguments here would actually be that the founders of the country never intended it to be a continent-wide, gargantuan, third largest country in the world after India and China. That was never an intent. The idea that these people had was largely that it was going to be an agrarian society with a few cities here and there. There would be some addition of population and territory, but never that it grow into the empire and unwieldy behemoth that it would be virtually impossible to govern in any democratic fashion. It's very clear that that was never an intent. So one of the solutions then, jumping far ahead there, that you could have for how to deal with this issue would simply be to start breaking the United States up into smaller, more manageable chunks, which would be easier to govern in a democratic fashion. That's one route that you could go, and I'll drop discussion of that at that point. But another route that you could go, of course, is that reapportionment, a recounting, and having a very, very large legislative body, about which a bit more later. There was a growth in the U.S. Congress, and I'm going to put some figures on the screen, as you get through 1800, 1810, 1820. Now you see, after 1820, there starts to be a more radical divergence from that ideal of about 40,000 or even 50,000 Americans per representative in Congress. And I don't think that it's necessarily an accident that, famously, a couple of the founders died on July 4th, 1826, and were about the last couple standing. So, you lost that generation. You lost that generation of founders, and you had subsequent generations of people who were grabbing for power and who liked things just the way they were, and liked a nice big congressional district because it made them personally more powerful. It made bribery more effective. Buying off somebody was lobbying somebody was much easier with a smaller body with larger districts, and you start to get this professionalization eventually of running political campaigns and doing the math on how you can manipulate elections and get elections to turn out the way that you'd like them to. This is much easier to do in a body of even up to 435 people than it is to do in a body of 11,000 or 7,000 people. It's a lot easier to buy off, the third or half of the people you need to pass something or to block something, if you're looking at a number of 435 than if you're looking at a number of 7,000 or 11,000 people who would have to be very responsive to a very small collection of their neighbors, and what would turn out to be congressional districts that were truly representative. You get to the point of the 1910 census, which tells you that you should have 435 members of the House, and that reapportionment happened in 1911, and there was a reapportionment act. Now, another thing is that Congress had to pass a reapportionment act once every 10 years, and would draw that up and would do so. The 1920 census comes out, and you see a bigger shift, especially with a lot of immigration and with a lot of people moving from rural areas to cities, in which there was a heavy urbanization of Congress. The 1920 census told Congress that rural areas and rural states were going to lose out in a big way, and that cities were going to gain very small congressional districts, and a lot of them. And effectively, after 1920, the Congress people from rural areas and rural states decided that they were going to simply block action on reapportionment by not doing it. And this is blatantly unconstitutional. It is a blatant violation of Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution. But the problem is that when the legislative body, which is supposed to be doing that, doesn't do it, there's not really a specific remedy for what's supposed to happen. Are people supposed to go and grab their Tommy guns and shoot their way through DC to make it happen? What was the solution there? And the fact of the matter is that there wasn't any. There was no attempt to do anything about reapportionment between 1911 and 1929. At 1929, you kind of come up with this obvious crisis of hypocrisy, because you're about to hit another census. You're going to have the 1930 census, and you still haven't done anything about the 1920 census. So these Congress people who were fat and happy and really very much liked things the way they were and wanted to keep their power and influence exactly as it was, decided to pass a law in 1929 in order to cap things at 435 representatives in perpetuity, so they said. And they actually had the word permanent in the law. That word permanent was there because they wanted to no longer have to pass once a decade a law regarding further apportionment, that they were just going to cap things at 435 and say that the reapportionment that would happen in the census was no longer to add people, but rather was going to just reshuffle representatives between states based in a cap of 435. And this is how you start to just be forcing more and more people. You end up with a form of inflation here, where you end up adding more and more people to congressional district without raising the number of congresspeople. I will state that there was actually even an exception to that, because the only U.S. states that were added after 1929 were Alaska and Hawaii. And when they came in around 1960, Congress was presented with a whole nother problem, which was that you have to have at least one representative for each state. And Alaska and Hawaii would otherwise have no representation at all in Congress there until the next census and until you did some reapportionment. So what they actually did for a temporary period was they bumped up the size of the House. See, it can be done. It can be done when they have to do it. They passed a law to temporarily bump up the size of the U.S. House a little bit to accommodate Alaska and Hawaii, and then after that transitional period, they agreed to bump things back down to 435 representatives and do it, and effectively people in the other 48 states all took a little bit of a hit as Alaska and Hawaii got reapportioned those representatives. And that's the way that things have been frozen in amber, depending on how you want to look at it, 1929, 1911, or the early 1960s. Now you might be saying, well, it would be simply impossible for the United States to function if it had a body of 11,000 representatives, or if it had a body of 6,000 or 7,000 representatives. And I would argue, first off, that's not entirely true. If you look at the People's Republic of China, the National People's Congress, which has a unicameral body, has 2,878 representatives. And yes, there is only one legal party in China. However, they do debate things. They do have votes, and it is a parliamentary body, and it does function. The United Kingdom, which is a much smaller country than the United States, has just under 1,500 members. There's 650 members of the House of Commons. That's more than 200 more people in their equivalent of the House than the United States has, with just a fraction of the population of the United States. They also have 835 lords who, in between, I don't know, their inbreeding and stamp collecting, and also show up sometimes to act as basically the U.S. Senate. India has the Lok Sabha, which has 543 members. They also have the Rajya Sabha, which has 245 members. It's a bicameral legislature of people who speak many, many languages, which has between 788 and 790 members and does function. Italy has a bicameral legislature of 951 members. A much smaller country than the United States. France, much smaller country than the United States, 925. The European Parliament, which is supranational and a federation, much as the United States is a federation of states, has a unicameral legislature of 720 members who speak at least 29 different languages. Germany's Bundestag has 736 members currently. And you have various other countries such as Indonesia and Japan, which have between 680 and 700 members in their various systems. So it is possible to have a workable system of very large bodies. One possible solution, as I mentioned earlier, is you might want more than one country. I don't know that you can really have democracy and 350 million people in a country that spans from Hawaii to Maine and Guam to Puerto Rico. I don't know that that's the democracy and that sort of quasi-global empire is tenable. So you might want to think about that as a solution. But you very definitely want to think about, if you would like to have more impact, more direct impact on your congressional representation, you're going to want to have smaller congressional districts. Now there is like I said, the 50,000 person formula gets you to just about 7,000 representatives in the U.S. House. The 30,000 formula gets you to over 11,300 members in the U.S. House. And there's even been a proposal of something of having a cube root of the number of people in the United States determine the number of members in the House. And that would currently give you about 705 House members, still with your 100 Senate members. Although I would argue that the cube root solution, although steps in the right direction, doesn't even double the number of representatives in the House, and in fact I still think would be wildly unconstitutional. If you'd like to know more about these issues, is there anybody trying to do anything? You could be one of the people trying to do something. You could advocate for having a House that's more representative of the number of people in the United States, that it would be harder to bribe. It's a lot harder to bribe 11,000 or 7,000 or 700 people who are more directly answerable to a more local population than it is to try and bribe 51% of 435 people. And there are some people working on that. One place you could start would be with the website 30,000. I am putting that information on the screen. I'm also going to put a link in the description. There's a nonprofit group out of Dunwoody, Georgia, that is trying to raise attention for the issue and get people involved. This is also something that you could do on your own, where you could not vote for candidates who aren't going to raise this as an issue and something that they would work on if they were in Congress. The way Congress is operating right now is on the assumption that Congress does have the right to reapportion itself. Well, then maybe you should be electing people who say that they're going to reapportion themselves in accordance with the constitutional precedent and with founders' intent. In terms of attacking this through the courts as being unconstitutional, very little of that has actually been done. There wasn't really much of a direct challenge to the 435 cap until a 2009 federal lawsuit brought by some residents of Mississippi who were saying that as a smaller state, they were getting screwed on the concept of one person, one vote. There was a 3-judge federal panel in circuit court who just sort of struck that down. There was a summary judgment for the government, which was on the opposite side of that lawsuit, and I think was extremely disrespectful of the rights of those Mississippi filers and of Americans in general. I find it ridiculous when the math is just the math don't math. Obviously, these justices simply did not think that they should be making any waves and just kept things the way they were. Damn math. There has never been a case about this since 1929 that has made its way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has simply never had to hear a case about it, and perhaps some other people should bring lawsuit in federal court about the blatant unconstitutionality of the 435 number. Maybe there are many other arguments that could be made outside of the one person, one vote argument or the state relative to other state size argument. There could be a lot of arguments made around founders' intent and so forth. If you are interested in educating yourself more on this issue, and I encourage you to do so, There's some great scholarly arguments, including most recently in a 2025 Penn State Law Review article, which I highly recommend, which the PDF of which is free to download, and which I am also going to put a link for in the description of this video. So you can arm yourself with some knowledge, and the author of that paper makes some excellent counter arguments for what he already knows are going to be the arguments for keeping things exactly as they are. So thank you for sitting through this, another depressing video. And if you do enjoy my content, again, enjoy. You can like, subscribe, and all of that good stuff. It does help me out. Thanks for following Ignored Facts. Hopefully this brings something to your attention and gets your blood rising in a sense in which you might do something about it. Until next time, folks, take it easy.